We are picking up, or I'm picking up, I should say, on part two of a session that is focused on time and space in Israel. We are members of a 3,500-year-old tradition with lots and lots of holidays. Many of them, most of them, I should say, are biblical. We've got some post-biblical holidays like Hanukkah, but we have a series of 3 holidays or festivals that were created in Israel in the early years, in the first decade actually, and have evolved. Like my last session 2.5 weeks ago, on the 6th, I think, I talked about Mount Herzl, the mountain of memory, which is the epicenter of sacred space in Israel. Today we're going to be looking at tonight, because Shirel and I are already on a different time. And by the way, it's legitimate to drink anything you want. Just please don't open up a beer or a whiskey in front of me now. You can do that in our time Saturday night. So I'll see you there for the end of the Pesach, what we call the Chametz fast here. Can you see me? You can see me, Shirel, because I've lost you for a reason, for some reason. Shirel, can you see my...
Yes, we can see you, but I can't see your screen. I don't know if you shared yet. We can't yet.
Okay, that's why. Let me do it. I did the wrong button. Nothing like technology. And let me see if I can get you now. Now I got you, and I can even see you. Now it's good. Good. So today, as I said, we're going to be looking at the Jewish national holidays. Last session focused on 3 components, just a brief review because I don't think all of you were there, and that is Mount Herzl on the western edge of the city of Jerusalem, containing 3 components: the final resting place of Theodor Herzl, the founder of political Zionism, at the crest of the mountain. Next to him, many of the past prime ministers, presidents, speakers of the Knesset, finance ministers, political leaders who led the people. So that's at the crest of the hill, this pantheon of great leaders and the ideologue Herzl. On one side of it is the military cemetery, Mount Herzl, which I talked about how its evolution in the past generation and the increased personalization of the site. And at the same time, I also spoke about the change, of course, since October the 7th, and hundreds of more graves added at military cemeteries across the country. And the third part, chronologically, because it only was created by law in 1953, was Yad Vashem, the memorial site for the Holocaust. All those 3 are in one contiguous area on this Har Zikaron, the mountain of memory. But today, we're going to talk, as I said, about time rather than space. In order to kind of get into the sense of time, I remind ourselves that those of us who grew up in the Jewish faith realized that, or chose to join the Jewish faith, realized that we sanctify time more than space. And I go, of course, back to Avraham Yeshua Heschel, who a couple generations ago wrote how Judaism is a religion of time, aiming at the sanctification of time. Unlike man, who is mostly space-minded, whose time is unvaried, homogeneous, to whom all hours are alike, the Bible senses the diversified character of time. There are no 2 hours alike. Every hour is unique and the only one given at that moment, exclusive and endlessly precious. Right? We just celebrated Pesach. Right? We know. Jews all over the world know exactly when Pesach is. Right? It changes. People say Pesach is early, Pesach is late. It's always the same time every year. It's just we compare our time to, the Western calendar rather than to our calendar. He continues, Heschel. He continued, I should say, and he said, Judaism teaches us to be attached to holiness in time, to be attached to sacred events, to learn how to consecrate sanctuaries that emerge from the magnificent stream of a year. Our Shabbatot are great cathedrals. And our Holy of Holies is a shrine that neither the Romans nor the Germans were able to burn, a shrine that even apostasy cannot easily obliterate. That is Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement. According to the rabbis, it's not the observance of the Day of Atonement, but the day itself, quote, the essence of days, which, with humanity's repentance, atones for the sins of man. So he's setting the stage for what I'm going to talk about in the next 45 minutes, how Jewish ritual may be characterized as the art of significant forms in time, as architecture in time. Think of Shabbat, think of ending Shabbat with Havdalah on the weekly, think of the calendar. Most of our observances, Shabbat, the Rosh Chodesh, the new moon, the festivals, the Shabbaton, the sabbatical, and the Jubilee year, depend on a certain time or hour of day or season. The main themes of our faith lie in the realm of time. We remember the day of the Exodus from Egypt, as I mentioned, the day when we stood at Sinai, and our messianic hope is the expectation of a day at the end of the days. So, unlike great Roman cathedrals, as he mentions, you don't go to see a St. Peter. You go to the Western Wall when you make a pilgrimage to Israel, of course, and you go up to Jerusalem. But it's not the same. The stones, in fact, aren't holy. What becomes holy is the fact that today there are probably tens of thousands of Jews at the priestly blessing at Birkat HaKohanim that takes place in the intermediate days of Pesach, between the first and the last days of Pesach. We, in the state of Israel, created a new calendar, which is made up of 3 moments in time. The first, chronologically, is happening next week already. The Hebrew word is Yom HaZikaron for those who read Hebrew, L'Shoah U'Legvura. Most people refer to it as Yom HaShoah. It's just a lot easier to say, but it does a disservice to what the day is all about. Right? It was created in the early days of the state. I'll go through the law in a couple minutes, but Hebrew translates in English as the Memorial Day for Holocaust and Heroism, and it takes place on the 27th of Nisan. I'll explain why that date and why not another date. Then, a week later, we have a holiday or a holy day called Memorial Day for Fallen Soldiers, but it's a much longer name. The English Fallen Soldiers and Victims of Terrorism Remembrance Day in Hebrew is Yom HaZikaron, and if you remember in my first session, those who were there, I talked about how memory is one of the most important components, most important words in the Hebrew Bible, and the notion of actualizing memory. As Yosef Chaim Yerushalmi said in his book Zachor, we do that weekly, we do that daily, and we do that annually, for example, in the Pesach Seder. So the day of remembering of victims, fallen soldiers, and victims of terror. It wasn't always the name. There was a name change. We'll talk about that later on in the session. And finally, rounding out this 10-day period of national holidays is Yom Ha'atzmaut, Independence Day. Every year you can see the calendar days, the 4th of Iyar, the 5th of Iyar, the 27th of Nisan. They are dates that are actually fixed in time. But how were those dates actually set? Well, Memorial Day for the Holocaust, a debate in the early years of Israel began over what we should do. How do we sanctify time? By commemorating the 6 million lives who were lost. And so there are lots of mourning days, and there are lots of fast days in the Jewish calendar. And of course, the most gut response would have been the 9th of Av, the summer, July or August, depending on the year, where we commemorate the destruction of the First Temple and the Second Temple and many other, the Spanish expulsion in the late 15th century. We commemorate many, many events that happened on or proximate to that particular date. But the leaders politically in the early decade of Israeli independence said, but this is different. This is something different and needs to be marked according to a different time. And so the debate waged, as you can suggest, as you can imagine, and the Orthodox members of the government at that time thought one way and the secular members thought another way, and they agreed to commemorate it or to link it, the sanctity of remembrance of the victims of the Holocaust, to a moment in time particular to the Shoah. Should it have been January 30th, commemorating Hitler's rise to power, November, the night of Kristallnacht, the night, September 1st, of the beginning of the Warsaw Ghetto, the first transport to Auschwitz? No, they decided to connect it to the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising. The only problem is that the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising began on the 15th of Nisan, which is Erev Pesach, the night of the first Seder, for you, the first Seder for Passover. You can't have a Memorial Day on the evening of Passover, and so they put together the calendar. They rooted this time connecting to the story of the Holocaust, particularly the gargantuan story of the Shoah, particular moment in time when the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising began, not the only uprising, but the most famous, the longest lasting perhaps, the one with the largest number of participants in it, and they linked the Memorial Day to the Holocaust and heroism to that particular day. We'll talk about who the Holocaust was, and we'll talk about who the heroes were in a few minutes. Independence Day was the no-brainer, as we say in modern biblical Hebrew. Why Independence Day? Well, there's a day. It happened to be on Friday, the 14th of May, 1948. The Hebrew calendar was that date, right? July 4th is July 4th is July 4th for you. So the 5th of Iyar is the 5th of Iyar every single year. It moves, of course, depending on when, this year it's in May 3rd, I want to say. I haven't wrote it down here. Where is it? This year it is on May 5th, but May 1st. Did I say May 1st? Which is also May Day, which is another story. And it can't fall on Shabbat, of course, so it's complicated, but it is Hey Be'iyar whenever that falls out on the Hebrew calendar. And then the founding fathers and mothers said, we need to have a day to commemorate the thousands of people, and people oftentimes don't remember this, but 1% of the Israeli population, 600,000 Jews living in the land of Israel when we declared independence in May of 48, 1% of the population were killed in the war. That's a 3.3 million American equivalent killed in a war. That's an unfathomable number. We need to have a special moment in time to sanctify the memory of those who fell in the War of Independence. And so Memorial Day was linked to Independence Day. And literally when Memorial Day ends, Independence Day actually begins. So you can see the 4th of Iyar, Memorial Day, the 5th of Iyar, Independence Day, 30th of April, and then the 1st of May. Is there a link Is there a story to be told about these 3 days that the founding fathers and mothers decided to sanctify, right? Is it, as I mentioned 2.5 weeks ago, this narrative or this foundational story of Mishoah Tkuma, from the Holocaust to rebirth, right? What stories are we choosing to tell? Are the stories that we're telling today in 2025 the same as the founding fathers and mothers told when the state was born 77 years ago? Questions to which we can ponder, and maybe we can talk about in the Q&A in the last part. We have a parallel in our Jewish calendar that happens every single year. We call them in Hebrew Yomim Hanoraim. You call them the great or the enormous or the powerful days, but in English they're called the high holidays. And think about it. From the beginning, the Rosh Hashanah, from the opening, from Rosh Hashanah, at the beginning of Tishrei, 10 days later, we close that period with the holiday or the festival of Yom Kippur. And there's something to be said about the period leading up to Rosh Hashanah, right? The period of the previous Hebrew month of Elul, where we go through a process of early morning prayers in the Sephardic tradition and lots of penitential prayers and lots of thought and introspection and reflection. And then we have Rosh Hashanah, and then we close that high holiday cycle with Yom Kippur. What the founding fathers in Israel did was created a parallel, not different, but parallel, sometimes meeting, maybe sometimes not meeting, story of 10 days of Israeli national holidays, beginning with the story of remembering Jewish life in the diaspora and the Shoah outside of Israel, Yom HaZikaron, Memorial Day for Holocaust and Heroism, connected to a reason, not the reason, but a reason for the birth of the modern state of Israel. And then we continue through the story of the heavy price we paid for independence in the Middle East. And we continue to pay through the fallen of many, many soldiers, and many more, of course, since October 7th. And then we finally end it with the celebration of joy of sovereignty and the sense of we have successfully not just waited for the Messiah to be sent by God, but rather we have successfully created a new Jew who is at the center of this sovereignty. And those of you who were here on my previous session might remember I talked about the difference between Ribonut and Rabbanut. Rabbanut being led by the rabbis, the authority of the rabbis over almost 2,000 years from the time of the destruction of the temple, interpreting God's law, to Ribonut, Jewish sovereignty, with we the people being the sovereign rather than God being the sovereign. Does this therefore mean that the founding fathers were intentionally, or maybe not, creating some sort of high holiday period of a civic religion in Israel? It's amazing that Israelis of almost every brand, shall I say, celebrate or commemorate this period, except for one or perhaps two. The ultra-Orthodox don't buy in, and I'm doing a big brush stroke over 13% of our population, but the majority of the ultra-Orthodox do not really theologically at least think that there should be a Jewish state until God sends the Messiah. The majority of ultra-Orthodox do not serve in the military. So the Zionist piece and the military piece aren't necessarily part of their core story. But yet the story of the Shoah is part of their story, because they, the Nazis and their accomplices didn't distinguish between observant Jews and non-observant Jews. Everybody who had a Jewish grandparent was murdered. So for many Israelis, if you ask in a poll, probably the vast majority, will say that they are secular, which means they have nothing to do with organized religion. But yet, in a certain way, I think they can't really use that word secular, because they live in the land of the Bible, according to the calendar of the Bible. They speak the language of the Bible. They celebrate the holidays of the Bible. And of course, there is this new Yomim Hanoraim, this new period of national civic holidays that in many ways are parallel with, as I said, or compete with those that we've kept for thousands of years in our biblical story. The image of course, is the Western Wall. And one of my favorite pieces, I chose a small little excerpt from Aleph Bet Yeshua, the late Israeli author, who describes in his essay, The Wall on the Mountain, the tension between what happens at Mount Herzl, the epicenter of Jewish time and Jewish space in the modern era, right? Herzl's grave, a great leader's grave, military cemetery, Yad Vashem, and what you see, the Kotel, the Western Wall. And I read from Abi Yoshua. The ceremonies around Memorial and Independence Day have once again revealed the vast difference between two sites which are formerly utilized by the State of Israel, the Western Wall and Mount Herzl. Now, something to keep in mind is that the Western Wall was not accessible until 1967 to Israelis. The Western Wall fell as a result of the War of Independence under Jordanian control, and Israelis had no access to it. And so perhaps this new kind of civic calendar and the civic sacred space. Even that word doesn't, it seems like an oxymoron in English, right? A civic sacred space, right? The temple of Zionism on Mount Herzl develops and grows and evolves in the almost 20 years when we had no access to the ancient repositories of memory of the Old City, the Mount of Olives, Mount Zion, the City of David, etc. He continued, Memorial Day for the Fallen in Israel's wars opens with a ceremony which takes place right here at the Western Wall. On the other hand, the opening ceremony for Independence Day, celebrations on Mount Herzl, on the other side of town, reveal to us a place full of grandeur, power, and clear symbols of hope, a place which serves as the context for an impressive occasion which could be the source of pride for any nation. You might remember in my last session I talked about, I compared Jerusalem and Mount Herzl at least to Washington, D.C. and the plethora of memorials that have been built and continue to be built and changed in the museums added on the Smithsonian, so too in Jerusalem, our political capital, evolving over time. Herzl's grave in the center, he's referring to Mount Herzl, is that of a unifying and beloved figure. The military cemetery gives dignity and honor to those who sacrificed their lives for the independence of all of us. Yad Vashem emphasizes the moral justification of establishing the state, both in terms of the inner account of our nation and in terms of the account between us, the Arabs, and the other nations of the world. This museum balances Jewish history superbly between exile and restoration. In other words, he is making that argument, I think, that this Mount Herzl becomes the epicenter of sanctity of the story, right, of Holocaust life outside of Israel, the heavy price for independence, and the idea that we need to have an independent country, right, the three components of Mount Herzl, in sharp contrast to what we see on the eastern side of the city, in and around the Old City. So, Memorial Day for Holocaust and Heroism, in the full Hebrew name. There is an image which those of you who have been with me in Poland, I think the Schultzes were with me, Marion, you might have been with us, I think, too, in Poland a few years ago, in Lithuania, maybe not. But I'm only picking Harris and the Schultzes and Marion because they're the first two on my Hollywood squares that I see. So don't take it personally if I didn't include anybody else. Anyway, but this is an image that is in the central part of the Memorial Square, the Warsaw Ghetto Memorial Square in front of Yad Vashem. And as I already mentioned, there are lots and lots of Memorial Days. Don't bother reading this. But why the 15th of Nisan? It only becomes law in 1959. In other words, Israel is born in 1948. You know, the gates, the war is over in 1945. It takes from 1945 to 48 to 1959 in order to actually make it a law and create Memorial Day for Holocaust. Why? All right, let me rephrase the question. Who is the Holocaust? Well, that's pretty straightforward. It's the 6 million Jews who were killed in the Shoah. Now, when I say Holocaust, I know that there were tens of millions of other people who were murdered in the Shoah. But when Yad Vashem was created, the site in 1953, its purpose was to commemorate the 6 million victims, Jewish victims. And as Elie Wiesel, the famous Holocaust survivor, said, although not all victims of Nazism were Jews, all Jews were victims. And we as sovereign Jewish people chose to create this space and now to create this date to commemorate the victims. But who are the heroes? Interesting. The heroes, small group of Jews who the Zionist fathers and mothers in that first generation of Israel wanted to recognize for their heroism. And if you look at this image on the right, it looks, and it is, by the Jewish artist Natan Rappaport, a very heroic, almost mythological piece of art, where you see larger-than-life figures, including the main character of the leader of the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, Mordecai Angelovich, in the middle, looking up to heaven. Look at this image in just a couple minutes. But it's clear that the founding fathers and mothers, without explicitly saying who the heroes were those people, mostly young men and young women, who realized that they were given a death sentence, did exactly what Abba Kovner, some of you were with me in Vilnius a few years ago, said in Vilnius on New Year's Eve, 1941, 1942, said it's clear that the Germans have a plan to murder all the Jews of Europe. It's clear that the Jews of Lithuania are first in line. We will not go like sheep to the slaughter, that's his term, and then we will fight back. And it was mostly young people, their late teens, early 20s, who decided that we're going to be killed, might as well take as many Nazis down with us as we possibly can. Most of the people who fought in the uprisings were killed, but they were one of the group of heroes that the founding fathers referred to. The second group, you might remember a movie not that long ago called Defiance, if I'm not mistaken, about the Bielski brothers who fought with the partisans in the forest, right? There were the people of the uprising in the ghettos and the camps. There were the partisans in the forest. And then there was a small group, very small, of less than 36 men and women, who who were living in Palestine under British occupation at the time volunteered to fight with the British and parachuted behind enemy lines in Germany, the most famous of whom is Chana Senesh, and tried to warn the Jewish communities in those countries, Slovakia and Hungary, what was happening. They were captured. Most of them were killed either in the camps or were murdered there. And so the founding fathers and mothers said, the heroes are those who didn't go like sheep to the slaughter. It's not our term in Israel. It's the term of those people who were in Vilnius and in Warsaw, who said, we're going to kill as many Germans as we possibly can. So what's fascinating is that in Israel, in the past 60 plus years, is the notion of what is heroism has changed, because Israeli society, as I mentioned in my last session, has changed significantly. And who we see and how we don't judge, but remember. We are people of remembrance, not necessarily people of judgment. And so we're here to remember the story of Shoah. It's remembering who those heroes were, including today, the person who shares his or her piece of bread, which might be their last source of sustenance because they're on death, they're about to die, but sharing it with someone else is an act of heroism as well. Or giving your child a circumcision inside of a ghetto, or having your son read Torah when he reaches the age of 13, right? We look at heroism in a different perspective today as we did in that founding generation. So as I mentioned, the heroism and the physical resistance today is being seen much more in the context of a broader understanding of resistance. A hero is someone who resisted not just by picking up a weapon, but in all sorts of spiritual ways as well. The famous iconic images, of course, from the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, the tough, quote, fighters, young men, young women, young children, you'll see in the next picture as well. And ultimately, the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising ends when the Germans have to flatten, and there's a picture of Warsaw, more than 90% of Warsaw was destroyed by the Germans toward the end of the war. And that story, the leaders of the Jewish state, the nascent Jewish state, wanted to make sure that young, new Jews born in the land of Israel would be socialized around a story that there was Holocaust, that people went like sheep to the slaughter, and there were these heroic figures who stood, even this young famous boy in this iconic image, who stood strong in front of the Nazi onslaught, and even though they were killed, they refused to go like sheep to the slaughter. I brought this picture because it's similar to what you would see if you were in Warsaw, and it's the plaza in Yad Vashem. It's called the Warsaw Ghetto Plaza. And there are two pieces to it. In Warsaw, it actually is a piece that's one in front of the other. The piece on the left, the last fighter, the ghetto fighters, appears on the front. And if you don't know, you might miss the piece on the back, which is called the Last March. And if you look at the Last March on the right, you'll see in my red circle, the spiritual leader, maybe the rabbi, holding a Torah, looking up to heaven. We're not sure where, we're leaving the ghetto, we're going to a camp, we're going to a gas chamber, we don't know, but still looking up to heaven. Contrast that to Mordecai and Levitch on the left-hand side, the image of the Warsaw Ghetto hero who's fighting, knowing he's going to be killed, and he was killed, of course, knowing that he was going to be killed larger than life. It's the same artist who's using the same technique and the same style, but creating very different visual images, telling us a story. The moral of the story is, quite simply, we want young Jews in this new state in Israel, based on the model in Warsaw, to be like Mordecai and Levitch, and not to go like people to the like lambs to the slaughter. What's fascinating, it's hard to see on this size of a picture. I don't know how big your screens are at home, but you can kind of see how in the image on the right-hand side, you see there's a little child looking out at us, and you can see over here is a woman looking backwards. And why is she looking backward? Maybe her husband fell. Maybe she's hopeful that she'll be able to return home. Why is the child looking at us? To bring us into the story, perhaps. And it's fascinating because when this was made in Israel in the 1960s, a copy of it was made, I should say, by the artist, the museum decided to put it one next to each other. And I think it's fascinating because when we look at the full name of the day, the sacred time of Holocaust and heroism, in my eyes, and we can talk about this in the Q&A afterwards, is that they're all heroes. We're not sitting in a position of judging whether the people on the left behave correctly or the people on the right behave correctly. Who can we possibly be? We can never fathom the challenge that the people in Europe faced under Nazi occupation, but yet it's clear that we need to understand that the majority Jewish response was that of the right, not of the left, right? Resisting and staying alive and trying to maintain the dignity of humanity and not stealing from each other and celebrating the Jewish calendar and doing whatever we had to do to retain the dignity of life as long as we possibly could. So there's a story. We figure out how to tell that story in time. Here is the law, right? To commemorate, I've just read the part I've highlighted and read, commemoration of the disaster and acts of heroism and revolt. Okay, very few acts of revolt, physical revolts, but that was what they were talking about back then. If it falls on a Friday, Remembrance Day. So again, how do you deal with the challenge of these days falling out on a Shabbat or on a holiday? Well, not a holiday, but on a Shabbat. Remembrance Day shall be remarked by a 2-minute silence, during which all work and all traffic shall be suspended. There will be memorial gatherings, popular rallies. The government had to come up with a mechanism in order to sanctify the time to remember the story. And the story, as I said, of Holocaust and heroism. So if you drive in Israel, and I'm going to put this on, I was doing a check with Shirel before I started, and one of my cats was in the room, and I wanted to make sure that the video worked. And as I pressed it, and I'm warning you now, you will hear a siren. Don't worry, Mike and Shirel in Israel, and if anybody else is in Israel don't have a siren, I want you to see this short little movie with the siren, what happens every single day, as the law stipulates, at 11 a.m., there's a 2-minute siren, and whatever you're doing, whether you're working on the production line in the factory, whether you're walking your dog on the street, everybody stops for 2 minutes of solemn reflection. And here I will play briefly the video. So it is a siren, but it's not a live siren. And life goes back to normal. Well, not quite to normal, but sorry. Go to the next slide. Life goes back to normal, but it can't really go back to normal. I mean, you're just driving on the highway and all of a sudden you stop and you get out of your car and nobody's really worried about getting run over because everybody's doing that. And by creating that law and creating that time, we sanctify that time. There's a ceremony that begins the night before at Yad Vashem, and we have Holocaust survivors who light 6 flames in front of, or actually next to, the piece of art of Rappaport. I shall show you back over here. So you can see there's 2 parts of the sculpture. On the left, out of the picture, is the place where the survivors light the 6 eternal flames. They each tell their story. Every year there's a theme about it, whether it's the righteous amongst the nations who saved the people who light the flame, whether it's the individual stories, whether it's a particular type of heroism, and we of course have the prime minister and the president and heads of and various diplomats who come, and that is that moment at Yad Vashem. Starts in the evening. The next morning we have the siren ceremonies in school. It is an important part, it is an essential part of Israeli society. Not to say that Israel exists because of the Shoah, as I mention all the time. Israel exists despite the Shoah. There was lots of pre-state, pre-Second World War development and growth and construction of the Jewish community in the land of Israel. Had there been an Israel, historians can ask the question, would there have been a Holocaust? Not all the 6 million Jews who were murdered were committed to living in Israel and were Zionists. That's something really important to remember. But an essential part of who Israel is commemorating the Shoah. It's to the point where not on Yom HaZikaron LaShoah U'Gvura, not on the day of memory of Holocaust and heroism, but when visiting heads of state come to Israel, where do they go as part of the diplomatic protocol? They go to Yad Vashem. In order to understand Israel, the reason for Israel's existence, we need to make a pilgrimage to Yad Vashem. So our foreign ministry protocol dictates. Next day, a week later, is the Memorial Day, created only in 1963 for fallen Israeli soldiers. However, it took until the late 1990s, where there was an addition to the name, there's a change to the name, and it began to be called Memorial Day for Fallen Israeli Soldiers and Victims of Terrorism. Why? Because by that time, we had already begun to have a lot of victims of terror from 1995, and even more so in the Second Intifada from 2000 to 2003, 2004. There were about 1,200 Israelis killed. And of course, I don't have the exact number. It'll be publicized next week probably, but I would guess, there are now, there were 1,200 people killed on October the 7th. Of them, about 850 were civilians, so we're going to have a number that's probably about 5,000 so far. People who have been killed by terror acts. And as you saw in my last presentation, there is an additional space in Mount Herzl to tell the story of the victims of terror. Right? If you are killed in war, in training, as a soldier on your way home from a base in a car accident, you're buried by the military in the military cemetery in your community, or in Jerusalem if you don't, if you were in 1948 didn't have a home. If you're killed in an act of terror, you are generally buried. You're buried in your community cemetery. The state pays for it, but it's not the military that pays for it. It's National Insurance Institute that pays for it. This is from a year ago, so there were over 24,000 people who have fallen. And the count begins in 1860, the first time Jews lived outside the walls of the old city, and historians argue over whether we should begin that or not. But today the number of victims of terror is well over 4,000. Ceremonies held across the country. Every single school in this country has a ceremony at that moment on Memorial Day. The ceremony, the day begins, I should have said, at the Western Wall. Abi Yoshua said that. The Hebrew calendar begins, the commander-in-chief of the army is there, the chief rabbi is there, there's a ceremony, bereaved families are brought there, there's a siren at night at 8 p.m., then there's a siren the following morning during a school day, kids don't have off for school, at 11. And there's an assembly in every school. And almost every single school in this country has a graduate who has fallen in one of the wars. And so when you walk into Israeli schools, you don't just see the trophies from the debating society or from the basketball team as you do in American schools. You see a corner dedicated to those graduates of the school. I live in a town that's 25 years old. Unfortunately, there were 27 people who were killed from our town since the war began in military action. It's crazy. And every single school has now a corner of graduates from that particular school, even though the school's only 20 years old, who were killed. And so these kids, it's not just Memorial Day in America, which is a day spent going to the beach, maybe shopping, but it's a day where we reflect on the stories of all those people that we know, our parents, our teachers, our classmates. Talked already about the siren. There's an unusual thing that happens on Memorial Day in front of the Western Wall, and these are pictures you can tell from 2021 or 2022 or 2020 or 2021 because of COVID. An unusual thing happens. We have two soldiers standing for the entire 25-hour period of Memorial Day at ease without moving. Now, it's not the same soldiers, obviously, but if you've all been to London, you see the changing of the guard, and these guys can stand for as long. You can look at them and laugh at them and make faces. They won't budge. Try taking two Israeli soldiers, men, usually men, but sometimes women, standing at ease for 20-minute shifts. It's absolutely impossible. They get spilkas, but they do. There's an eternal flame that is lit. The flag that is always there is brought down to half-mast, and to me, it's a fascinating moment because you really see the confluence of Judaism as a faith and a tradition connected to our former sacred space at where the temple was, and the modern flag of Israel and soldiers in uniform who are reflecting on that sacred time that the state of Israel chose in order to remember the fallen soldiers. There you can see more. I should send somebody usually asks me, so I'll preempt this in case there's a question later, and that is that many soldiers, but not all, swear their oath of allegiance at the Western Wall, and of course get their two symbols of the two presents from the IDF. One is their Bible, and the second is their weapon. And once again, on the following day, on a week after Yom Zikaron LaShoah U'Gvura, a week after Holocaust Heroism and Memorial Day, on Memorial Day for fallen soldiers and victims of terror, same thing. There's a siren, 2 minutes long, whatever you're doing, you stop. In recent years, I will have to add, and Shirel, you can add later on if you want as well, that siren has a much deeper connotation, and I think has most Israelis jump out of their skin more than ever before because of what we've experienced since October 7th. There is a siren, but my guess is in the future there's going to be more and more debates about whether we should be changing the siren to make sure it's a different siren than the siren that we hear when we have to run for rockets. One of the ways that we don't just celebrate in terms of space and in terms of time, but in terms of the public story and different artistic expressions, whether it's the design of currency. What's the 200 shekel note doing here? Well, this is Natan Alterman, one of our national poets, who wrote a very famous poem called Magash HaKesef. He wrote it actually even before Israeli independence. And here are the lyrics, the words, I should say. I'm not going to read all of them, but he writes a poem to try to give expression to the birth of Israel. And the land will grow still, crimson skies dimming and misting, slowly palling again over smoking frontiers as the nation stands up, torn at heart but existing to receive its first wonder in 2,000 years. As the moment draws near, it will rise, darkness facing, stand straight in the moonlight in terror and joy. When, across from it, step out toward it, slowly pacing in plain sight of all, a young girl and a boy, dressed in battle gear, dirty shoes heavy with grime, on the path they will climb up while their lips remain sealed, to change garb, to wipe their brow. They have not yet found time, still bone-weary from days and from nights in the field, full of endless fatigue, and all drained of emotion. Yet the dew of their youth is still seen on their head. Thus, like statues they stand, still, stiff and still, with no motion, and no sign that will show if they are alive or dead. Then a nation in tears, and amazed at this matter, will ask, who are they? And the two will then say, with soft voice, we are the silver platter on which the Jew state was presented today. And they fall back in darkness as the day's nation looks, and the rest can be found in the history books. That poem by Natan Alterman, like the poem Eli Eli by the young poetess and parachutist Chana Senesh, are kind of the central texts that Israelis read and recite in all the ceremonies around Memorial Day for Holocaust and Memorial Day for fallen Israeli soldiers. On that day, every single military cemetery, every single military section in a civilian cemetery throughout the country has soldiers standing next to the tombs to be there in case any of the friends or the relatives of the fallen soldier come to visit. And there is a uniform Israeli flag with a black ribbon and a little flower usually placed next to it. My daughter, when she was in her military service on Memorial Day, had to go up to a cemetery in Haifa, and she was actually very anxious because she had to go to a tomb of a soldier she obviously didn't know. He was killed. He was a pilot in the 1973 war, and she found it a very powerful day because the family was there, and it was almost 50 years before, and they were reflecting on the legacy, and it's a powerful moment. And again, whether you're standing outside of the Israeli Center in traffic in Tel Aviv, you're deeply reflecting on the significance of the number of fallen and the legacy of those people, that silver platter, who sacrificed their lives for the ability for us to have a sacred state. These are pictures. Some of them I showed you in our last session from the military cemetery in Mount Herzl. I was actually the day of Memorial Day, before Memorial Day, a number of years ago during COVID, I took my son, he was in the Air Force, and during COVID, he asked me one day, he said, Abba, what are you doing next week? I said, well, not much. I mean, there's Memorial Day. He says, no, before Memorial Day. I said, no, nothing. I wasn't guiding. So I said, can you take, me and my team up to tour? And I said, where? And they said, they really want to go to Mount Herzl. So we went to Mount Herzl, and the whole mountain was undergoing this change for the ceremony that ends Memorial Day and transitions into Independence Day. More of that in just a couple slides. I want to go through this. Sorry. I pressed the wrong button, sorry. One of the ways that we don't just take the time that we sanctify on a specific day, but there was a campaign that began a decade ago in order to perpetuate the memory of those who have fallen. And it was a campaign, and there's going to be different ones I know after this war, God willing, that will end soon. And that is Soon We Will Become a Song. And Israeli musicians like Yad Reichel, who some of you might know, took the music, keeps going out of this, took the music, took a letter, took a letter of a soldier. Soldiers write letters before they go into war, before they go into combat, for their family in case something, heaven forbid, should happen to them. And a number of top Israeli musicians took those songs, took those poems, took those letters, and transcribed them into music that became very, very popular, including the song by Yad Reichel, which I'm not going to bother playing now, but you can see at least from some of the lyrics. It keeps coming on, sorry. Some of the lyrics, right? And when the night ends and the sun shines, will you know, Mom, what we have seen? Trees around, towering treetops, but scorched trunks, big houses around, but they are ruined, their color faded. I'm walking on ruins, Mom. Believe me, they're here. There's no pear and there's no flower. We are not heroes because our job is grim. The sun will set, the darkness will come, and then we will sleep in our clothes in bed. Yes, Mom, it's important. It is hard and it is terrible. I swear that it is hard, but I am staying the ground. I'm staying. The ground is gray and the horizon is black, and the blue in the sky seems to slow, and it waits and doesn't touch the black horizon between them. There's a space, no connections and everything else, and it is very hard, but I'm staying. There's a wire fence, and after it, a drawn sword. Mom, Dad, and everybody else. We are not heroes because our job is grim. The sun will set, the darkness will come. Yes, Mom, it is important, it is hard, and it is terrible. By a Sergeant Reuven Politi, a last letter to his parents. All over the country, on Memorial Day, there are ceremonies in schools, as I mentioned. There are national ceremonies at the military cemetery in Mount Herzl, and there are ceremonies at various memorial sites of various brigades and branches of the military. The most famous, or the largest one, because the largest number of soldiers who were killed since 1948 are soldiers from the Armored Corps at the famous Latrun Armored Corps Museum, which has lots of parts to it. This part, of course, is a wall of soldiers' names, thousands and thousands of names. Many more, unfortunately, have been added since October 7th. Our last of the three national holidays is the most joyous of those holidays, the only joyous one, I should say, and that is Independence Day. It evolved. We celebrated, the day of our independence, but in the first year of Israeli, so the first year and a half, so December 1949, there is a race of the beacons of heroism, as it's called back then, where beacons, little flames, are brought from different places throughout the country, and the race, or the run, kind of like the equivalent, I guess, would be taking the Olympic torch, all across Greece or whatever before the Olympics. The finalists, they bring the torch finally up to Mount Herzl. A year later, they begin to have a ceremony on Mount Herzl that is becoming more and more ritualized, but yet not created in law at that point. But it begins to tell this transition, like the story of Hanukkah, of transitioning from the darkness of pre-state Holocaust to the light of Israeli independence. In our fourth year, Israelis were chosen from different communities to light torches, to be broadcast live on radio. We only had television in this country in 1969, and then we broadcast it on TV. And wherever you are today in Israel, doesn't matter where, you will turn on the radio or turn on TV, and you will watch the ceremony as it's broadcast live from Mount Herzl. And the Y-12, of course, symbolizing the 12 tribes of Israel. And this I love because there's a lot of meaning and symbolism. And the idea that this is a civic national holiday, I think, is mistaken, because it's not civic. The symbols that are chosen are part of our tradition, whether it's the 12 torches or many other symbols in all these national holidays, symbolizing the 12 tribes. Every year there's a different theme, could be social action, volunteerism, public service, etc., or different communities where people immigrated from. Not all the people, by the way, who light the torches are Jews. Remember, 79% of citizens of this country are Jewish, but 21% are not. More of that in a minute. The site of independence, where Ben Gurion declared independence in Tel Aviv, should be the central place where this day is commemorated, but it isn't. First of all, the place is being renovated for the past 4 or 5 or 10 years or whatever. Number one. Number two, it's small. You can only have 300 people in it. And again, we don't sanctify place, right? Independence Hall kind of is holy like the Western Wall is holy, but it's the time, that moment in our story of the 5th of Iyar, May 14, 1948, that becomes sacred. It's the celebration. As Ben Gurion declares independence, or as my last group before they closed the building down in, I think, it might have been February of 2020, outside of Independence Hall comes to celebrate the story, right? What do we do on Yom Ha'atzmaut? Well, typically, we pretty much go bonkers, for lack of a better word. We go out in the street, we party, we bang people on top of their head with these big plastic hammers. The top Israeli artists do, the shortest but the most overpaid gigs in every city on different stages, from about 8 in the evening till about 3 or 4 in the morning. People dance, live music. In my town of Modi'in, kind of boring little suburban community between Jerusalem and Tel Aviv, the central park in the city is filled with thousands and thousands of young people. We used to live a block away, and I'd go for a walk with my dog, and I'd see these like 8-year-old kids walking by themselves. No place in the world, in the Western world, has 8-year-old kids walking till 3 in the morning. But on Independence Day, they do. And of course, everyone has a barbecue. Why have a barbecue? My belief is, and I could be wrong, that there's a connection. When we had a temple, remember, we would sacrifice animals. So we don't have a temple to sacrifice animals, and we've replaced that with prayer. We still have to have some time where you have that nice, beautiful, pleasant smoke of animals barbecuing. And so everybody in this country does a barbecue. If you're married to a vegan, as I am, it's a bit of a challenge, but tofu also works on a barbecue. But I think if anybody would ever measure the amount of meat consumed by Israelis on Independence Day, it would be really disgusting. And then, of course, all sorts of Israeli foods are consumed, mostly salty snacks. Barbecues happen absolutely everywhere, on beaches, on the median in Jerusalem. One of the reasons we left Jerusalem is that we don't like having barbecues in the median in the city, but you name it, they are there. And the entire country is filled, it's like Los Angeles on a typical summer day. There's this like cloud of smoke over the entire country. The highlight is this flyover of the Israeli Air Force, where they fly over the entire country, and you'll see that in just a minute, but they canceled it last year in light of the war, and they've decided to cancel it again this year. Good, bad, whatever, but how do we create this 125-hour period where we celebrate our Independence Day? And part of the challenge is, how do you celebrate Independence Day when you're coming out of the trauma of remembering Memorial Day? Here's the ceremony. There are 12 flames being lit. A friend of mine, this is her father. He's an Israeli Arab. His name is Ahmed Eid. He was the former head of surgery at the Hadassah Hospital on Mount Scopus, describing why he's proud to be an Israeli. You can see the pictures of kids banging people on the head with hammers. And when after the torches are lit, there is this ceremony. You can see the soldiers in a Star of David formation from different brigades and units and divisions of the IDF. They march around Mount Herzl. It's kind of military. Then it segues into dancing, and then it segues into fireworks. And that is the note that all across the country, fireworks celebrations begin, and we transition from the trauma of Memorial Day to the celebration of life. Last year, I was abroad. This year, I'm going to be abroad as well. And in a certain level, personally, I'm glad I'm going to be abroad, because I don't know how this year, post-October 7th, I'm going to be able to celebrate Independence Day in the way that we traditionally do. In fact, last year, there was an alternate Independence Day celebration or commemoration that took place in Tel Aviv, and there'll probably be more of them this year. We've never been in a situation where we've had a war that has gone through 2 Pesachs and 2 Memorial Days, and we're going to look at things and we're going to tell the story very, very differently this year, and I believe in years into the future. Some would say we should celebrate even more when the war eventually ends. We'll see when we get there, hopefully soon. In the epicenter, behind the marching formation of the soldiers, is the tomb of Theodor Herzl. I've highlighted in red over there. You can see a little bit of the joy in the celebration. This is one of my younger son's best friends who was chosen one year to march. I saw him as I was with a group going out of Mount Herzl. I said, "How is it?" He says, "It is the most demanding thing I've done in the army." I said, "Why?" He said, "For a month and a half, we have to be here all day long and march." This guy was in a special forces unit in the engineering corps, but there is Natan Davidov standing there proudly commemorating or honoring his unit. So you can see, this is one of the previous years. The Minister of Culture and Education was there with all the people who were chosen to light the flames. You can see diverse ages, diverse backgrounds, men, women, religious, secular, etc. We celebrate, Google chooses to celebrate with us a couple years ago online. And of course, I love this moment to contemplate the 9 days leading up to this, Memorial Day for Holocaust and Heroism, the previous day of Memorial Day for fallen soldiers and victims of terrorism. I love this image of the meeting of the first political leader of Israel with the founder, Ben Yehuda, of modern Hebrew. And of course, to realize how far we've come. A picture of some guy guided having his, no, that's the Pope, of the Pope coming to Israel in 2000 for the first time, which is phenomenal to think that the Catholic world officially recognizes that we have a right to independence after 1900 years. To crazy guy like me making Aliyah and having 3 kids, those are my kids when they were a little bit younger, all born in Israel, the symbol of the sabra and the cactus. And what they do and what everybody else does is, on Independence Day, lots and lots and lots and lots and lots of Israeli salty snacks. Now, the most important thing you should be doing at this point is going to Trader Joe's, I think, or Whole Foods, and buying Osem's Bamba, because it's Israeli, it's salty, and it's actually healthy. It's filled with peanuts, a little bit of oil, and a lot of vitamins. But if you don't like that, you want some of the other Israeli snack foods. I always love sharing this with people and make them drool as I reach the end of our presentation. We have 2 national sports. I don't know if you know this, by the way. This is sport number 1. It's called the mangal. It's where Israelis work on their upper body strength and their wrist action in order to fan the flames of the barbecues. And the second pastime, and of course, they're filling up all of their pitas with all of their meats, or as I said, if you're vegan, with your tofu. The second pastime, the unofficial official Israeli sport, is called matkot. And at this time of year, tomorrow it's going to be about in the low 80s, I think, in Tel Aviv. Israelis go out to the beach. The beach is officially opened, I think, just last week, if I'm not mistaken. They go out and they play our unofficial official sport. It's official because there's no rules, there's no winner. It's just chaos and bedlam, but lots of fun. And then we celebrate by drinking classic Israeli beer. And one of my favorite breweries in the country, Malka, to commemorate Memorial to Independence Day, they come out with a limited series of Zionist luminaries. You know, there's Menachem Begin and Golda Meir and David Ben Gurion on the beer bottles, and just an image of the Air Force flyby in the COVID year, where you can see there's probably no greater symbol of Israeli sovereignty and that celebration of that time that we have together to commemorate our independence as Independence Day, where you could see the medical workers in 2020. The flyby of the Air Force went only over hospitals in the country because people weren't supposed to be outside in big spaces. And they didn't want to. They want to make sure people didn't do that, and so you see the staffs of the Israeli hospitals waving their flags to the Air Force that are flying by. I'm looking at my watch and I see that we have reached our time, which is good, because it's time not just to celebrate or to commemorate those 10 days of that sacred time between Memorial Day for Holocaust and Heroism, Yom HaZikaron LaShoah V'Legvura, 9 days later, Memorial Day for fallen soldiers and victims of terror, and culminating with the celebration of Jewish power and Jewish sovereignty, this rival perhaps, or this complementary 10-day sacred time in the Jewish calendar created in the last 77 years.
Thank you, Mike. I'm going to jump right into some of the questions that we received. There were a few about when you showed the video about the people that didn't stop on the side of the road. So maybe you can say a few words about the people that don't stop and why.
It's a great question. Look, there are 2 main sectors in Israeli society for whom that 10-day period is not sacred time. And that is the 13% of Israeli society who are ultra-Orthodox and the 21% of Israeli society who are Arab. The ultra-Orthodox mourn the loss of 6 million lives in the Holocaust, but they, by and large, don't choose the time based around the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising that the Zionist founding fathers in the first generation of Israel chose to commemorate Yom HaShoah. They have different days of mourning in the traditional Jewish calendar that they commemorate. The Arab Israelis, on the one hand, there's a not small number of them who do serve in the military. And we know that there are a number of Bedouin, Muslim, and Christian and Druze soldiers who have fallen, and police officers who were killed at the Nova Festival and other places on October 7th. And for a number of them, it is a day of mourning because they see themselves as part of the Israeli narrative. But for a larger number, the vast majority of Israeli Arabs, they don't, they're kind of asked, and they're put in challenging predicament where on the one hand, they're citizens of a country who are oftentimes in conflict with their brothers and sisters in neighboring countries or in the Palestinian areas in Gaza or the West Bank. So it's a big challenge. And there's certain parts of the country, like in the ultra-Orthodox neighborhoods in Jerusalem, where nobody stops. The traffic just continues to go and people continue to walk. And it causes more and more, I think, internal tensions within the very fragile fabric of Israeli society.
Thank you. There was another question about the siren. Where did the idea for a siren and that silence come from? And is there anything like that in anywhere else in the world? Is it based on Jewish tradition? Like, how did they come up with it?
It's a great question. I don't know. My guess is it wasn't invented by Israel. I don't know what the air raid sirens in England sounded like, but I remind you that in the Blitz in England, when I think 30,000 people were killed by German aerial bombings, they had these sirens all the time. So there's some connection to that. And there are sirens that are in Israel when there's a war and there are rockets, etc. But in terms of the idea of sanctifying time, it goes back to the temple, because we know when there was a temple. We know from two sources. One is the Talmud, which tells us that a priest would go up to the corner of the Temple Mount just before holiday, just before Shabbat, and would blow a shofar. People didn't have iPhones and watches back then, and so they needed to know when Shabbat was coming. So you had a 20-minute warning in advance, and then as Shabbat came, you had that siren going off. And if you're lucky enough to be in Machane Yehuda, the market in Jerusalem, or maybe even the Carmel market in Tel Aviv, as Shabbat is about to come, you'll generally see an old guy walking around with a little trumpet, blowing the horn, literally telling us that it is almost time for Shabbat. So we know from the Talmud, we know from archaeology, they found a stone, I don't know if Jody talked about this in any of her first sessions, of a stone inscribed to tell people where the place that the priest should stand on the corner of the temple, to warn people with the shofar that the time of the sacred time of Shabbat or holidays coming in. So we have a tradition of creating a loud noise to be spread as far as possible to tell people that now is this moment in sacred time. And so it's a combination probably of some tradition that pre-existed Israeli independence of an air raid siren, together with the importance of having a note, an oral cue to remind us at a particular moment on Memorial Day, on Holocaust Memorial Day, that this is that moment where we ought to stand at attention for 2 minutes and reflect on the significance of the story.
Thank you. Maybe I know it's time, but I'll just squeeze in a last question that was asked about the Holocaust Memorial Day. Someone asked about who will be lighting the flames now that we're, once we no longer have any Holocaust survivors alive. So maybe you can say a few words about the new traditions and how the commemoration is happening nowadays as we, are much further from the time it happened.
So there are still Holocaust survivors, and the majority are led by Holocaust survivors, but in the future we'll transition into the second and third generation of Holocaust survivors who will tell the story of their parents and of their grandparents. I have no way of predicting what will happen in 50 or in 100 years, but there's no question that the further we get away from a moment, the harder it is to tell the story. And I will share one last thing, even though you didn't ask the question, and that is how Israel is doing and what's going to happen. And the question that some of you may be thinking but didn't write down: how is Israel going to commemorate October 7th? We don't have an answer yet because it's still happening, right? We're day 550 something of October 7th. It hasn't ended. When it ends, and God willing it will end sooner rather than later, we'll have to figure out, are we going to integrate this into Memorial Day for like Memorial Day? Or as we did already last year on the first day after October 7th, there are various ceremonies. There's a state ceremony that the families of the hostages boycotted because they weren't, and there's a lot of politics going on. But are we going to have it on October 7th? Are we going to have it on the date that it was, which was Shabbat Simchat Torah? I believe in the future there will be a specific day commemorating the trauma and the tragedy of October 7th. 1. 2, how do you tell the stories in terms of the space? And I was just this week down at the Nova Festival, and 3 of the kibbutzim that were heavily damaged on October 7th, and the site of 1,600 vehicles that were totally destroyed or partially destroyed from people's vehicles around the Gaza envelope on October 7th. And the times that I've been there since November, December of 2023, the transition and the changing of how the story is being told and how the story will be told is something that we're going to continue to grapple with. But the tragedy also the beauty is that we are a people, as I said on our first session, endowed with this incredible sense of memory. And we have a responsibility to continue to perpetuate the memory. How we perpetuate that memory, who tells the story, what parts of the story we tell, where we tell the story, what physical memorials are we to create in the spaces where the tragedies happened, and how are we orally going to perpetuate that story is something that we'll be thinking about for many, 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 many years into the future, because there's no question that October 7th is a gargantuan event of tremendous proportion that I'm definitely sure will impact how we look at sacred time and sacred space. Thank you all for coming, and Moadim L'Simcha, Chag Sameach, and may it be a meaningful period of national Israeli holidays coming up. See you soon.